While living in Dallas, Texas, in the mid-70s or late 70s, you don't have to be in Texas very long to realize that Texans are proud. As people have learned, they can have a tendency to sometimes be put off by that Texas air. You might remember in President Bush's acceptance speech, he said that there are some things that people don't like about me. He said, some people don't like my Texas swagger. In Texas, we just simply call that walking. When you visit or you're in Texas, they'll have these maps. And the map will have the great state of Texas and then all of the rest of the United States or even the world surrounding it, as if Texas is the center of the world. Well, the truth of the matter is, the Scriptures tell us that Jerusalem is at the center of the world. That God set His heart and His eyes upon the city of Jerusalem. And in a probably a more real geographical sense, it is true that the land of Palestine, the land of Israel, however you politically correct want to address it, in 1988, when Joanna was born, while we were I was in Israel studying in Jerusalem, when we were in the formal land of Israel, we could say that she was born in Israel. When I was in the occupied territories, or when I transferred from Israel to Jordan, I had to say she was born in Palestine. You couldn't say Israel, or you would never make it through the checkpoint. Because the land of Palestine, or the land of Israel, is the land bridge of three major continents: Asia, Africa, and Europe. And throughout history, of course, the trade, the commerce, the business, the politics, the travel, and yes, the armies of the world had to pass through Palestine or through modern-day Israel if they were going to go anywhere in the known world. And of course, that is why the land or the area of Megiddo is known as Armageddon, or the place of the great battles. More world wars have been fought on that land, and there is one great battle yet to come. So the Bible identifies Jerusalem as the center of the universe, and I just want to put the map up here so we get a little bit of an idea of Palestine in the days of the New Testament. And the reason is because the city of Jerusalem, which is located right there at the point of the pen, the city of Jerusalem is in kind of an odd place. You say to yourself, well, God, why did you pick Jerusalem as the place to set your heart? Why did you pick Jerusalem to be the center for the kingdoms of Israel? Why did you set Jerusalem to be the place where Jesus would die upon the cross? Because when you put the map, and this map has the trade routes. The red lines are boundary lines of different areas. The black lines are major trade routes. You don't see a major trade route going through Jerusalem, do you? Which is the J right here. Here's the area of Megiddo, or Armageddon, and you can see how everything crisscrosses because of the way the mountains are. Why Jerusalem? Why not down in Jericho, where lots of people crossed? Why not over here in Joppa, where ships came and where travelers would move across the known world? Why Jerusalem? Why up in the mountains? Why in the hills? One of the interesting things is that because of the placement of Jerusalem, it was in kind of a neutral political area for the 12 tribes of Israel, although in Judea it was a neutral kind of area. We also see that because of Jerusalem being up in the mountains like this, and not along the trade routes, people didn't have a normal or regular reason to go to Jerusalem. The only reason you went to Jerusalem was for the festivals. The only reason you went to Jerusalem was for the feasts, to offer a sacrifice, to have acts of repentance, to have offerings of thanksgiving and kindness. God, why didn't you make it easier on the people? And why didn't you make it in Joppa or Jericho or over here along the King's Highway? Why didn't you make it somewhere where it'd be really convenient for the people, where they could stop in and worship you while they were on their way to go somewhere? God doesn't really tell us specifically, but we do know this from the geography and topography of Jerusalem, that those that wanted to worship God at the temple had to make some special effort. They had to set aside special time. And our God is a God, I think, that both wants and certainly deserves sacrificial worship, sacrificial ministry, and not just our times of convenience. Now, the fact that the city of Jerusalem was up here meant that it was always a poor city, always a city in need, because they didn't have the great commerce. They didn't have the, hotels, motels, inns, and so on and so forth that were very much a part of the prosperity of the trade routes. And so it was always in need, always had a hope of gifts. And the quality of life in Jerusalem was directly tied to the quality of the spirituality of the people. Because a people that weren't spiritually minded, a people that weren't dedicated to Yahweh Elohim, the God of the Old Testament, would be people who would be complacent about their faith and therefore would not be so interested in going up to Jerusalem. You can see on a human level why the temple had turned into such a marketplace, a den of thieves and robbers during the festival times, because when the people were not spiritually minded, well, the priests had to make as much as they could when the holidays were there. It's kind of like a Memorial Day or a Labor Day or the summer or things like that to people who are in tourism. There's a window of time when you got to make your money, and so you charge the premium rates. And so we find in Jerusalem that they charged the premium rates. It was an expensive city to live in. As a result of that, Jerusalem was always in need. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, as we continue our study in the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul will speak about the need of a collection for the saints. And this need of the collection may have in part have been due to the fact that the city of Jerusalem was always in need and the saints were always in need. In 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 9, Paul instructs them about the collection for the saints in Jerusalem and his plans to visit with them. Notice in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 1, he says, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so do you also." The word for collection was a special word. It meant a collection usually for sacred reasons, for special reasons. And there was a special need for the collection of the saints in Jerusalem. Now, in the Old Testament period, Jews, pious Jews, holy Jews, dedicated Jews, would have a temple tax. They would have a priest tax. They would have certain gifts that they were obligated to give. There was a tithe, a 1/10 of all income was to go to Jerusalem, to the temple, to the priest, to support them in their particular ministries. But this collection is not for the temple, it's not for the Jews, it's for the saints, the believers in Jesus Christ who are there living in Jerusalem. And it was just not a gift, it was a sacred sacrifice that was given to the Lord. Now, concerning the collection of the saints, he says, as I directed, as I administrated, as I orchestrated the churches of Galatia. And so this is a very large, broad project of fundraising, of charitable giving that the Apostle Paul is working on. He says, as I directed the churches of Galatia, I'm going to direct you also. Now, we should note that in the Greco-Roman world, charitable giving was not uncommon. There is much written about charitable giving. But you need to understand the difference of the motivation. In the Greco-Roman world, the motivation for charitable giving was power. It was prestige. It was influence. It was to bring praise to one's self. It wasn't self-sacrifice. It wasn't compassion. It was a matter of, where do I influence the influencers? Where do I buy my opportunity to exalt myself? And there were rules for it and principles for it as to how you did it well. But it had nothing to do with compassion and care. Even today in America, let's not fool ourselves. Lots of wealthy people set up foundations, and they solicit donations to their foundations. But their motivation, and I don't know all of their hearts, but their motivation, I don't think, is deep compassion or care for hurting people. If it were, they'd be dumping a whole lot more of their own money into the pot. You know, to set up a foundation in America is to avoid all the taxes. If you're making a lot of money, even underneath the best Republican system, you could be paying 50, 60, 70% of that money back to the government. And so if you say to yourself, well, if I set up a foundation, I not only get to keep 30 or 40%, I get to keep 100%. Because I get to direct it, and I get to draw a salary from it, and all the rest that goes along with it. So I'm not to disperse or discourage all foundations, but we need to be honest about these kinds of things. Very often, they are all part of a public relations, a spin, an image building, so on and so forth. I'm reminded back, you remember a few years ago, Ted Turner donated, I think it was almost $1 billion over a period of time to charity. And that was quite good. From his foundation, he was going to donate $1 billion, I believe, over about a 5 to 10. It ended up being more of a 10-year period due to the economic conditions that crashed in on him. But you know, he directed that money through the United Nations. He directed it through foundations that would accomplish his philosophy and his desire and the way he wanted to see culture influenced. So it wasn't just a great, compassionate, charitable thing. It was politics. It was power. It was influence. I'm reminded of the response when people challenged Donald Trump to give likewise. Donald Trump's answer was, I don't know if you remember this, but his answer was, well, if I give it all away, I won't have any to generate more capital and more income, and the way I approach it is I keep it and I build it, and then when I die, I will give it all away. Hello, Donald. When you die, it's not yours anyways. You don't have it anymore. It doesn't matter anymore. You're not fooling anybody. In fact, Donald, you're fired. So he speaks of this collection to the saints. Now, there were different reasons. Of course, there were the poor. We know in Jerusalem there were the persecuted, 1 Thessalonians 2:14. says, "For you, brethren, became imitators of the churches of God in Christ Jesus that are in Judea. For you also endured the same sufferings at the hands of your own countrymen, even as they did from the Jews." We know that the saints of Jerusalem were often poor. They were persecuted. There was a sense of indebtedness of the other churches to help the mother church, in a sense. Romans chapter 15, verse 2. And you remember in the controversy of Acts chapter 15, when they were trying to decide, does a Gentile have to become a Jew to become a Christian? And of course they said no. Paul was reminded by the leaders that they should always remember the poor, which Paul says he was so eager to do. Now in verse 2, he's going to give some principles upon which this collection was to take place. He says this, "On the first day of every week, each one of you is to put aside and save as he may prosper, so that no collection be made when I come." This is a command. It's what we call an imperatival participle. And the sense is that this is something that they are under responsible obligation to do, even though there is a sense of freedom to it. Notice the components of this one sentence, this one verse. On the first day of the week, this marks the fact that they had made a transition from Judaism to Christianity. Judaism met on what day? Shabbat, the seventh day of the week. Christianity had so influenced the different communities that they had started to meet on Sunday to celebrate the resurrection. They had continued on Sunday celebrating the resurrection, and today we meet on Sunday for we celebrate the resurrection. And so it's on the first day of every week, and so it's tied together with the day of worship. It's tied together with the day of celebration. On the first day of every week, and on every week, it says that it's something that we should regularly do. We ought to have the habit of doing, of sitting down weekly and exercising stewardship over what the Lord has given to us. On the first day of every week, each one, that's individually or privately. No one is exempt from stewardship in relationship to God. Each and every person is responsible to evaluate their stewardship and to say, "Lord, what should I sacrificially give to you? What should I set aside?" It's an individual thing. It's also a private thing. He's not talking here about tithes to the church necessarily. He's not talking about on the first day of the week bringing it to the church. For the church is only but one place where we can exercise stewardship. It is very legitimate to set aside money for other mission projects that we believe in, for other organizations, to set aside money to spend on a neighbor in order to build a bridge of evangelism for them, to show generosity to those that are poor in our neighborhood or our community. On the first day of every week, each one, and notice what it says, each one of you, there is also a universality to it. Everyone is to exercise stewardship before the Lord. On the first day of the week, every week, each one of you is to put aside and to save. To put aside and to save. There's a kind of a systematic aspect to this. We're to set it aside and we're to save it. Almost as if you have a separate bank account, some people have a separate checking account that they have set aside for money, and they save it for projects so they can joyfully and cheerfully and sacrificially give as the Lord would direct them. We're to do it systematically. On the first day of every week, each one of you is to put aside and save, and then it says, as he may prosper. There is a proportionality to what ought to be given, a proportionality to what ought to be given. You know, some years ago, Michael Jordan gave like a couple $100,000 to a foundation. Okay, come on, that's like chump change. I mean, that's like cleaning out the linen out of your pocket and giving some money. Everybody, oh, isn't that wonderful? Look at how sacrificial. Give me a break. Most of it was taxes anyways. But there's a proportional aspect, and we see that in the temple. You remember when Jesus was sitting around and watching the people put the money into the temple treasury. And the rich people would come in, and they'd throw their money in. And of course, they talked about the blowing of the trumpet. We know now from archaeology and from history, the descriptions, that they had a big chest. And rising up out of the chest was a trumpet-like, not instrument, but vessel. And it's kind of like those ones you see at the science museums and that, where you put a penny in, and it spins around, and it goes around, and then finally it goes in the hole. It was designed like that so that the rich could throw their money in, and it would go round and round and clang, and the trumpet would sound, and everybody would go, oh, what a wonderful gift. And then there was that little widow with the mite, and she plinked it in. It probably hardly made a noise, but Jesus noticed it and mentioned it, that it would be a part of the record of biblical scripture and sacrifice. Yes, we are to give proportionately. As we are blessed, do we have a big bonus that comes along? Do we have a windfall that comes along? Has anybody hit anything in the stock market? Please see me in my office after the service. If by some reason, if one were to hit some kind of a lucky whatever, is that a time when we have proportional giving? Do you say to yourself, God has richly blessed me, and I ought to seek to bless others? Proportionate giving. For the person who barely can pay their bills, God understands. And what widow's mite or what little you give certainly is honored by God. We all need to give, not because God needs it, but because we need to. We need to periodically, systematically, individually, privately demonstrate and commit ourselves to the fact that God is not our money. God doesn't need the money. We need to give it. But there is a systematic thing to it. There's a proportionality. And then those who are abundantly blessed and have great resources, then it's time for us to give abundantly. And then finally, he says, as he may prosper, so that no collections be made when I come. It's to be freely, voluntarily. It's not by compulsion. It's not something that is to be forced upon us. Regularly, individually, universally, systematically, proportionately, and freely. Now, one of the problems, or one of the things we just need to be careful of, is that we do not fall into this mindset or this theology today of health, wealth, and prosperity preaching. That, give to God, and He will give you 10 times back. Give to God, and He will multiply your, fruit 100%. Cast your bread upon the water, and it will come back. And the Malachi, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse. I mean, these guys are great, and ladies for that matter. I mean, they've worked this. It's a routine. They know how to preach it, and it's an abuse of scriptures. On the other hand, there is something to the stewardship that when we do give to the Lord gives back to us. And that the Lord cares for us. Philippians, my God shall supply all your needs according to His riches and glory in Christ Jesus. Where does that verse come from? It comes from the fact that in the previous verse, Paul admonished them, and Paul encouraged them, and Paul exhorted them, and Paul praised them for their sacrificial giving. And because the Philippians sacrificially gave Then Paul said, you know what? God will supply all your needs. That isn't a promise for everybody. That's a promise for those who have stewardship and sacrificially give. Matthew 6:19, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Luke 12:21, so is the man who stores up treasure for himself, and he is not rich towards God. 2 Corinthians 8:11 says this, but now finish doing it also, so that just as there was readiness to the desire, so there will also be a completion of it in your ability. For if the readiness is present to give, it is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what a person does not have. We give proportionately. We give in stewardship. And beloved, if we don't learn to give, we will never know what it is to have and to truly possess the best things in life. Interesting, on the front cover of Newsweek magazine, interesting article, how to say no to your kids. How to say no to your kids. This is not a Bible preacher. This is not a Christian theologian writing. These are psychologists and sociologists who are looking at what the affluence of my parental generation, of the baby boom generation, is doing to the next generation with all the affluence, all the things that we are pouring out upon our children, and how it is having a great negative effect. You need to read this article if you have children or grandchildren, or just to read it. And it's a phenomenal insight into setting limits in an age of excess, and how we are just pouring upon our children gift upon gift upon gift. We think we're doing it out of love, and quite honestly, we are hurting them. For we are creating a consumer, a heart, a lust that will never be filled. Kids who get too much too soon often have trouble coping with the inevitable ups and downs of life, being able to wait, being able to be patient, being able to be satisfied with the basic things of life. Part of stewardship, part of giving, is part of learning that it all belongs to the Lord, and that we need to have those kinds of limits. Paul says regularly, individually, universally, systematically, proportionately, and freely. He says, Corinthians, I want you to give, to help the poor of Jerusalem. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 3 now. He says, when I arrive, and this is the third time that Paul has mentioned this. In 4:19 and 11:34, he also said it. Whenever I arrive, or when I arrive, whomever you approve, whoever you put to the test, and you approve, I will send them with letters to carry your gift to Jerusalem. Paul's talking about several people going here, because he's expecting a large collection. There was a need for several people to go. Josephus, in his history called Antiquities, writes of a Palestinian Jew and 3 of his friends who convinced a Roman noble by the name of Fluvia, who was a convert of theirs, and I think he was a convert to Judaism, to send valuables to the temple in Jerusalem. Fluvia, being a new convert to Judaism, bought into probably the health, wealth, and prosperity preaching that was there in their day, and he gathered together great valuables and treasures and sent them on to Jerusalem with these 4 men. They scammed all of the treasures. They never made it to Jerusalem. They hardly probably made it out of Rome. As a result, Caesar Tiberius ordered that all Jews be banned from Rome. Beloved, when we don't exercise good stewardship, when we find, high-profile people caught in the news from ministries and that who have been scamming or robbing or cheating, it turns off the whole world. And unfortunately, it tarnishes the gifts that are given. He says, when I arrive, whomever you approve, I will send them with letters to carry your gift to Jerusalem. And if it is fitting, the word fitting would better be translated advisable. If it is advisable for me to go also, they will go with me. Now, on another occasion, we will study the advisability of this, because this becomes quite a controversy. You might remember from the book of Romans chapter 15 and from the book of Acts when the prophet Agabus came to Paul and urged him not to go to Jerusalem. And Paul says, no, I'm going to go to Jerusalem. But there was a great controversy. And of course, Paul went on to Jerusalem, which led to the riot, which led to his imprisonment, which led to him on his way to Rome, and all kinds of controversy. Some people say Paul should have listened. Others say, no, he was Paul. He could do what he wanted to do. But Paul at least is looking to whether he himself should go along because of the importance of the collection. In 1 Corinthians 16:5, he says, but I will come to you after I go through Macedonia. What was in Macedonia that Paul wanted to pass through there? Well, we had the church of Philippi, which was a very, very generous supporter and a primary church that helped Paul in his missionary efforts. You had the church of Thessalonica that was very important to Paul. And there was one other church in the area of Macedonia, and I'm sure you know the name. It was the church of Berea. Paul says, I need to go through Macedonia, for I am coming through Macedonia. Verse 6, and perhaps I will stay with you, or even spend the winter, so that you may send. The word send means not just to say, adios, see you later, but to provide provisions and help, so that you may send me on my way wherever I go. Paul was going to spend the winter there. Part of the reason is because by the middle of September, the shipping and sea travel had begun to shut down. There were more storms. I'm sure you wouldn't want to be out this season anywhere south of Florida boating or sailing these days. Not the sailing season. Although they didn't have hurricanes, they had tremendous storms. They had their cold weather. The days, just like as we find, the days grow shorter in the sense that the daylight is lessened. A lot of cloudy nights, and when you are a sailor and you are out on the great sea, what do you need to navigate with? The stars. And with the clouds and the storms and all the rest, it made navigation very difficult. And so it shut down, and Paul said, I will spend the winter with you. Verse 7. He says, for I do not wish to see you now just in passing. I don't want to just come in and say hello and then goodbye. For I hope to remain with you. In the Greek text, the term with you is moved to the front of the sentence. And if we wanted to emphasize it the way Paul is emphasizing it, we would say this, it is with you that I desire to stay. And then, if the Lord permits, I hope to remain with you for some time, if the Lord permits. And of course, we know from the book of James, James exhorted us, when you make plans, always say, if the Lord wills, if the Lord wills. Verse 18, he says, but I will remain in Ephesus until Pentecost. You know, the Pentecost is the Greek name for the Feast of Feast of Weeks. This is the 49 days after a Passover. Pentecost was the Greek version of it, or the Greek name for it, rather than the Hebrew. But I will remain in Ephesus until Pentecost. For a wide door for effective service has opened to me, and there are many adversaries. Paul, throughout his ministry, anytime he saw a wide door of evangelism, a wide door of ministry, there was always opposition. And we ought to expect that. If we're going to be a growing church, if we're going to be influencing people at work, if we're going to be influencing our neighbors, then expect to have a few dirty looks, a few vile words, a few shut doors, a few rejections, some opposition to our faith. That is all part of it. 2 Corinthians 2:12, he says, "Now when I came to Troas for the gospel of Christ, a great door was opened to me by the Lord." Colossians 4:3, "Pray at the same time as well that God will open up a door for me." When they arrived and gathered together the church, they reported how God had done, how he had opened up a door. Beloved, we need to pray that God will open up a door for us, for evangelism at Berean Bible Church, in our community, in our neighborhoods, in our work, and amongst our families. We got to open up the doors, and we got to open up the groups so that we can welcome people in. And we're not going to grow until we really, in our heart, our spiritual heart, pray, God, open up a door. Do you understand our friends, our relatives, and our neighbors are going to hell? A Christless eternity? And if we don't say something to them, if we don't talk with them, if we don't give them the opportunity, how can they hear unless someone's sent? We need to have that burden for people who are lost and be willing to be rejected or persecuted or get the bad looks or the bad words that we might reach them. Paul says a wide door is effective, has opened up for me. Why? Because Paul was asking people to pray that a door would be opened up to them. He was praying that evangelism would take place. And that's what we need to do. We need to pray that God will open up doors for us. But you know, in order for God to open up doors for us, we as a congregation need to open up. We need to take some of the closed or tight little circles that exist amongst us that make us so comfortable, and we need to open those up so that other people can also come in. Well, what is the application for today? I think it's pretty clear. Two big applications. First of all, how do you view your relationship to your resources? How do you view your stewardship? The Apostle Paul says that collections for the saints are something that should be done regularly on the first day of the week, individually or privately, universally, systematically, proportionately, and freely. Even young people today, those of you who babysit, those of you who work somewhere, those of you who have jobs, bless you for doing it. It's important. It's part of learning a work ethic. It's part of learning responsibility. It's absolutely great, and it's wonderful that you're doing it. But learn now, even now, to exercise godly stewardship by taking a portion of that and setting it aside and saying, what can I do with this to further the cause of God? What